You're watching the Everything Network. By the early 1980s, New York's underworld was changing faster than its traditions could keep up. Once balanced under the invisible order forged after Lucky Luciano's commission, were now under siege. Federal prosecutors had found new tools to dismantle them: wiretaps, RICO laws, and insider witnesses. One by one, bosses fell. Yet, in the Bonanno family, two figures would come to define the last era of genuine old-world power: Anthony Sparrow and Anthony Graziano, men cut from the older cloth, who kept the code alive while the world around them modernized. Anthony Sparrow was born in Brooklyn in 1929, a generation that remembered the old waterfront gangs and the post-war rise of organized crime. He grew up in the Bath Beach section of Brooklyn, where gambling, card rooms, and loan operations were a part of everyday life. By the 1950s, Sparrow was already a known quantity in local rackets. His calm demeanor and strict sense of order made him stand out in a world built on impulse. While others sought fast money, Sparrow built slow power. He came up under the Bonanno family at a time when the organization was shifting under constant internal pressure. Joseph Bonanno's exile in the 1960s had left the family fractured, and even by the 1970s, the scars of the so-called Bonanno War had not fully healed. The family, under Philip Rastelli, began to rebuild, but federal pressure was relentless. Sparrow stayed under the radar, preferring the quiet of Bath Avenue over the noise of Manhattan clubs. His rackets were typical but reliable: illegal gambling, loan sharking, and control over card rooms throughout Bensonhurst and Gravesend. By the late 1970s, Sparrow's calm professionalism made him indispensable. As Rastelli's power grew, Sparrow was appointed a capo regime, responsible for one of the family's most lucrative territories in Brooklyn. His base was the Bath Avenue social clubs, small storefront operations that acted as headquarters for his crew. The men around him, loyal, mostly from the same neighborhood, were old-school operators who handled disputes with precision and kept outsiders at bay. The 1980s brought a new kind of crisis. The FBI's long-running infiltration of the Bonanno family, led by undercover agent Joseph Pistone, working under the alias Donnie Brasco, exploded into public view in 1981. The revelation that an FBI agent had spent 6 years inside the family was a humiliation that shook its core. Several senior members were indicted or murdered in the fallout, including Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, who had unwittingly vouched for the agent. During this chaos, Anthony Sparrow's role expanded. He was part of the stabilizing faction that helped reorganize the Bonannos under Rastelli's guidance from prison. Sparrow's Bath Avenue crew provided structure and income when other territories were in disarray. While many in the family panicked, Sparrow avoided rash decisions. He became a quiet enforcer of discipline, ensuring that the family would not crumble entirely under the embarrassment of the Brasco case. By the mid-1980s, the Bonanno family was fighting for survival on two fronts: against law enforcement and against itself. The federal government had launched the commission case in 1985, targeting the leadership of all 5 families. Though the Bonannos were not directly named in that indictment, largely because the FBI still considered them weakened from the Brasco fallout, the pressure remained. Rastelli's imprisonment left a vacuum filled by acting bosses and street panels. It was during this period that Sparrow's influence peaked. Anthony Sparrow was the embodiment of the quiet Don. He rarely raised his voice, avoided public displays, and never courted headlines. Associates described him as a gentleman, cold, courteous, and calculating. His meetings were conducted in small cafes or homes, never the gaudy clubs that had betrayed so many others. He kept his operations small but efficient: numbers games, Shylock loans, and control over local unions. He earned millions over the years, but never flaunted it. While Sparrow kept the family steady in Brooklyn, a younger, more active faction began to rise in Staten Island and Long Island. From that generation came Anthony T.G. Graziano, another Bonanno loyalist who would later share power with Sparrow and help shape the family's direction into the 1990s. Anthony Graziano was born in 1940 in Long Island City, Queens. Like many men of his era, early life revolved around neighborhood crews, small-time rackets, and the codes of loyalty learned in corner clubs. He rose through the Bonanno ranks during the 1970s, operating primarily out of Staten Island. Graziano had a reputation for two things: money and composure. He was a bookmaker by trade, an organizer by instinct. His operations extended into gambling, loan sharking, and the financing of nightclub ventures that served as legitimate fronts for illegal income. By the late 1980s, Graziano had become a caper regime, controlling Staten Island and parts of Brooklyn. His approach complemented Sparrow's. Both men were cautious, profit-driven, and quietly ambitious. Neither sought the flamboyance that had doomed other bosses. They understood that survival depended on restraint. The Bonanno family's leadership in those years reflected the ongoing transformation of the American Mafia. With Rastelli aging and imprisoned, the family was run by a ruling panel system. A group of senior captains, including Sparrow and later Graziano, who managed day-to-day affairs. This decentralized approach was designed to shield the family from the kind of kingpin prosecutions that had taken down the Genoveses and Gambinos. Sparrow's rise to acting boss came in the early 1990s, after the arrest of Joseph Massino, who had succeeded Rastelli. Sparrow was seen as a stabilizing figure, disciplined, trusted, and old school. Under his leadership, the family regained some of its former order. He kept operations local and focused on traditional rackets, gambling, loans, construction kickbacks, and labor control. The Bonannos avoided the flamboyant crimes that attracted attention, like high-profile killings or drug trafficking on a large scale. Meanwhile, Anthony Graziano's influence was expanding. By the mid-1990s, he served as consigliere to the Bonanno family, a senior advisory position that made him one of the three most powerful men in the organization. Graziano's Staten Island base became one of the family's most profitable divisions, known for disciplined collection and minimal exposure. He worked closely with Joseph Massino after Massino's release, helping rebuild the family's reputation and income stream. The contrast between Sparrow and Graziano illustrated two faces of the same organization. Sparrow represented the waning old guard, men who came up under silent codes, preferring loyalty and discretion to spectacle. Graziano symbolized the adaptation of those principles to a new era, one where law enforcement scrutiny required flexibility. Both shared a deep respect for the old ways. Neither would cooperate with authorities, and both enforced the family's rules with quiet ruthlessness. Sparrow's downfall began in the late 1990s when federal investigators began focusing on unsolved murders linked to his Bath Avenue crew. Prosecutors accused him of ordering multiple hits in the 1990s, including the killing of Vincent Bickelman, a jeweler suspected of robbing one of Sparrow's associates. Another murder of Louis Tuzio, a Bonanno associate suspected of disloyalty, was also tied to Sparrow's approval. The Bath Avenue crew, which included younger gunmen like Paul Gulino, had drawn attention for its involvement in robberies and extortion, and wiretaps began to build a picture of Sparrow as the quiet authority behind them. In 1999, Anthony Sparrow was indicted under federal RICO statutes for racketeering, gambling, and conspiracy to commit murder. His trial in 2001 revealed the methodical nature of his rule: decisions made through intermediaries, orders passed quietly, profits laundered through small businesses. Witnesses described Sparrow as a man who spoke little but commanded absolute obedience. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Even in court, Sparrow remained expressionless, a man who had lived by the code of silence until the end. He died in 2008 at age 79 in federal custody, one of the last Bonanno leaders who had come up entirely under the old system. As Sparrow's era ended, Anthony Graziano's ascended to prominence. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Graziano became the acting underboss of the Bonanno family during Joseph Massino's reign. He managed the Staten Island and Brooklyn operations, keeping the family profitable while avoiding the internecine wars that plagued their rivals. Graziano's network included illegal gambling, loan sharking, and control of strip clubs and night spots, enterprises that kept cash flowing while providing fronts for laundering. Graziano was pragmatic. He dealt with non-mafia figures, partnering with businessmen and entrepreneurs who could move money discreetly. Unlike Sparrow's quieter reign, Graziano's period saw the Bonanno family engage more openly in the city's entertainment and construction scenes. Yet, he too maintained the family's discipline. Associates who spoke too freely were reminded of the consequences. The FBI's focus on the Bonannos intensified in the early 2000s, particularly after the arrest of Joseph Massino in 2003. Facing the death penalty, Massino made the unthinkable decision to cooperate with authorities, becoming the first official New York boss to turn government witness. His testimony confirmed decades of suspicions about the family's hierarchy and operations, sending shockwaves through organized crime. In the aftermath, Anthony Graziano tried to steady what remained. As underboss and later acting consigliere, he attempted to preserve the Bonanno identity amid chaos. But the damage was irreparable. In 2002, he himself was arrested in a racketeering case involving extortion, illegal gambling, and loan sharking. Convicted in 2003, Graziano served several years in federal prison. When he was released, the world he had known was gone. Surveillance, informants, and changing social attitudes had stripped organized crime of its former structure. By the late 2000s, both Sparrow and Graziano, once pillars of the Bonanno hierarchy, were symbols of an era fading into memory. Their leadership styles, though distinct, shared a commitment to the traditional mafia virtues of loyalty, silence, and hierarchy. They were among the last generation who believed in the notion of the family as something more than a criminal enterprise, an institution with rules and dignity. Yet their loyalty could not stop history. The late 2000s and early 2010s marked a period of disarray for the Bonannos. The Massino betrayal had shattered morale. Captains who had once sworn absolute loyalty to the family began cutting deals to avoid life sentences. Federal cases dismantled entire crews. The FBI had infiltrated the organization at nearly every level. For decades, the Bonannos had been defined by resilience. They were the family that always returned, even after humiliation. But now, even the name inspired caution. The once glamorous world of New York's mob was shrinking into a shadow of itself. Anthony Graziano tried to keep a semblance of order. From his base on Staten Island, he acted as mentor and elder statesman, guiding younger associates on how to operate quietly, avoid flash, avoid talk, keep the business clean. He remained loyal to the Bonanno structure, even as many around him drifted away. For years, he had been known as a man who could mediate disputes between factions, a skill that had earned him his place as consigliere. Even out of official rank, he continued to play that role informally. But law enforcement had learned patience. Federal prosecutors tracked his contacts, monitored his finances, and kept watch on his meetings. Graziano was still a figure of interest to the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. By 2011, investigators had reopened several old cases involving loan sharking and extortion connected to his Staten Island crew. Among the informants who surfaced during this period were individuals tied to his own family circle, part of a new generation that had no loyalty to the old ways. In 2012, Anthony Graziano was arrested once again, charged with racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy related to his long-time gambling operations. The indictment described him as a long-time captain and consigliere who continued to direct associates even while on supervised release. He was sentenced to 19 months in prison. It was not the magnitude of his earlier cases, but it symbolized the futility of trying to maintain old codes in a new age. The irony of Graziano's later years became public in an unexpected way, through television. His daughter, Renee Graziano, appeared on the VH1 reality series Mob Wives, which premiered in 2011. The show, centered on women connected to New York's mob world, inadvertently made Anthony Graziano a household name outside the underworld. For a man who had spent his life avoiding attention, it was an uncomfortable development. He reportedly disapproved of the show, viewing it as a violation of omertà, even though it did not directly implicate him in crimes. It was a reflection of how drastically the Mafia's mystique had eroded. Once secret lives now became entertainment. By the time of his death in 2019, Graziano represented the final remnants of a generation that had learned its trade from men who came up in the 1950s and 1960s. His passing closed a chapter in Bonanno history that stretched back to the family's founding under Joseph Bonanno himself. Those who knew him described him as disciplined, old-fashioned, and unbending. A man who believed in the rules even when everyone else had stopped following them. Anthony Sparrow, who had died more than a decade earlier, shared that same legacy. Both men were products of a time when respect and restraint were considered the marks of strength. Neither sought fame. Both lived and died as company men, loyal to their oath, faithful to the structure, and largely forgotten by the time the modern mafia's light faded. In the larger history of the mob, Sparrow and Graziano occupy a unique place. They were not innovators like Lucky Luciano, nor public figures like John Gotti. They were caretakers, men who inherited a system under siege and did their best to preserve it. Sparrow's Bath Avenue command and Graziano's Staten Island regime kept the Bonanno family functioning when its leadership was scattered and its name tarnished. Together, they represented continuity. The 1980s through the 2000s were decades of transformation for organized crime in New York. The Gambinos lost their flamboyant boss, John Gotti, to prison in 1992. The Genoveses retreated further underground, preferring stability to exposure. The Luccheses and Colombos were crippled by internal wars. And through it all, the Bonannos, though battered, remained active, rebuilt again and again by figures like Massino, Sparrow, and Graziano. Their resilience stemmed from the discipline of men who remembered when the Mafia still adhered to rules of conduct. Sparrow's leadership during the early 1990s marked one of those rare moments of equilibrium. He avoided unnecessary violence, preferring control through order. When the Bath Avenue crew got out of hand, his response was decisive but quiet. Associates who crossed him were dealt with swiftly, but he avoided spectacles. In his world, attention was danger. Graziano, coming from the next generation, adapted those same principles to a changing environment. He recognized that the old ways could survive only if the business model changed. Instead of large-scale hijackings or labor rackets, his crew focused on gambling, bookmaking, and low-level extortion, steady profits with minimal exposure. His background as a bookmaker gave him a businessman's perspective, and his calm, calculated demeanor earned him respect even among rivals. But both men were ultimately bound by the same forces that undid every boss of their era: informants, technology, and time. Wiretaps captured conversations once thought untouchable. Cooperators traded loyalty for leniency. The RICO statutes made even the most insulated leaders accountable for the crimes of their soldiers. The very structure that had protected the Mafia for half a century, the chain of command, became its undoing under the law. By the 2010s, the Bonanno family was a shadow of what it had been. Its leadership was fragmented, its ranks depleted. Federal prosecutors had not only imprisoned its hierarchy, but mapped it for the world to see. Yet even as the old order dissolved, men like Sparrow and Graziano remained figures of respect. Among surviving members, Their names carried weight, the last of the quiet dons who had never broken, never cooperated, and never sought the limelight. Anthony Sparrow's story ended in silence. After his 2001 conviction, he served his sentence without complaint, refusing all opportunities to cooperate. When he died in 2008, few outside law enforcement even noticed. For those who had known him, his passing marked the loss of a link to the Bonanno family's earlier, more disciplined days. Anthony Graziano's final years mirrored that same quiet dignity. Despite the irony of his fame through his daughter's television career, he had once operated in a world where anonymity was power. Now his name was part of pop culture. Yet in interviews and statements, he maintained the same tone he had always held, measured, unrepentant, and loyal to the only world he had ever known. Their deaths left the Bonanno family adrift in a new era where the old codes no longer applied. The Mafia that Sparrow and Graziano had inherited was built on silence, secrecy, and the slow accumulation of respect. The one that replaced it was fragmented, opportunistic, and exposed. They had come of age in a time when hierarchy was sacred. They left behind an underworld defined by survival. In the grand history of organized crime, the careers of Anthony Sparrow and Anthony Graziano form a bridge between two worlds: the structured mafia of mid-century America and the disorganized remnants of the 21st century. They were the last custodians of a dying institution, men who continued to live by rules long after those rules had lost their meaning. Both men understood that the life they had chosen was finite. The old neighborhood clubs, the envelopes passed quietly, the whispered meetings over espresso, those rituals belonged to another time. But as long as they lived, they kept those customs alive, if only as symbols of an order that once seemed eternal. When the history of the Bonanno family is written in full, their names will not headline it. They were not founders or revolutionaries. They were survivors. They held the line through decades of change, maintaining a sense of discipline and dignity when the rest of the underworld descended into chaos. Their influence, though quiet, preserved the Bonanno identity through its darkest years. The story of Anthony Sparrow and Anthony Graziano is, in the end, the story of the Mafia's twilight, men of loyalty navigating a world that no longer believed in loyalty. Their lives marked the end of an age when being a man of honor meant something tangible, and their deaths marked the passing of the last generation who truly lived by that code.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Boss, Michael Mikey Knows Mancuso, current leader of the family, a Bronx native, he is the son of Anthony Tony Knows Mancuso, a Lucchese family soldier who was shot to death inside a bar in 1967, when Michael was 12 years old. He became affiliated with the East Harlem Purple Gang in his early adulthood, and was injured in a shootout with a rival crew in Williamsburg, Brooklyn in 1976, subsequently being arrested on weapons charges, for which he would be convicted 2 years later. In 1984, Mancuso shot and killed his wife Evelina during a domestic dispute, later dumping her body on a bench in front of Jacobi Medical Center. He was convicted of manslaughter in 1986 and sentenced to 10 years in prison, being released in 1996. After regaining his freedom, he became a member of the Bonanno family and acted as a conspirator in the murder of Capo Gelando, George from Canada, Siasia, in 1999. In 2004, Vincent Vinny Gorgeous Bassiano promoted Mancuso to acting underboss, then to acting boss, after Bassiano was arrested on racketeering charges in November of that year. On November 30, 2004, Acting on Basciano's orders, along with Capo Dominic Cicale and soldier Anthony Ace Aiello, he had associate Randolph Palazzolo killed for infuriating Basciano. Mancuso and his co-conspirators were indicted on racketeering and murder charges stemming from Palazzolo's killing in 2006, pleading guilty in 2008 and being sentenced to 15 years in prison. Authorities believe he was appointed as official boss of the family after he began serving his sentence, and he controlled the organization from prison through a series of acting bosses. Mancuso was released from prison on March 12, 2019, with 3 years conditional release to serve. Highly on parole, he regularly met with fellow mobsters and associates, and he was arrested on supervised release violation charges on March 15, 2022. After pleading guilty, Mancuso was sentenced to 11 months in prison and another 3 years supervised release on July 28, 2023, and he surrendered to prison authorities on September 6. He is currently incarcerated at FCI Allenwood Low, Pennsylvania, and is scheduled for release on August 4, 2024. Acting boss, Johnny Skyway Palazzolo, current de facto leader for Michael Mancuso, a fellow member of the family's Bronx faction. Palazzolo was inducted into the organization in 1977 and remained active in criminal activity ever since, mainly operating extortion, loan sharking, and fraud rackets. In 1978, he served as a backup shooter in the attempted murder of associate Anthony Coglator, who was shot 11 times as he entered the driveway of his Staten Island home as retribution for having tried to kill a member of the family. Palazzolo was also involved in the murder of soldier Russell Morrow in 1991, luring him to the Black Eagle Social Club in Astoria, Queens, where soldier Joseph, Joe Desi, De Simone, and associate Peter, P.T. Boxcars Cosoletto shot him to death, with Palazzolo cleaning up the scene and disposing of Morrow's corpse. In 1994, he was convicted of interstate theft and sentenced to 2 years in prison, though he was later found guilty of running a loan sharking ring from inside FCI Allenwood Low, along with his father James and his son James Pallas, and his sentence was extended by 57 months. In 2004, Palazzolo was indicted along with acting boss Anthony Tony Green Urso and 25 other defendants on racketeering and murder charges. He pled guilty to conspiring to murder Mauro and was sentenced to 10 years in prison, as well as being fined $100 in 2006. Upon his release in 2014, Palazzolo was promoted to street boss, but was arrested a year later for violating his parole due to having met with family members Anthony Fat Anthony Robito and Frankie Boy Salerno. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison. In 2019, Michael Mancuso named Palazzolo acting boss to replace Joseph Joe C. Camarano Jr., whom he had recently shelved. Underboss, Johnny Joe Spirito. Longtime family member, Spirito was involved in the 1999 murder of Captain Gerlando Sciascia and was sentenced to 20 years in prison after conviction. Former family underboss, Salvatore Vitale, provided testimony to convict Spirito. He was released from prison on supervised release on September 1, 2020. Spirito is currently a target of the supervised release investigation of family boss Michael Mancuso and has been cited as the family's number 2. Consigliere Vinny TV. Badalamenti became family consigliere in 2019. He is the former capo of the Bensonhurst crew. Badalamenti has served as the former acting boss and consigliere. In December 2009, Badalamenti was found with Staten Island-based Captain Anthony Calabrese and soldier Johnny Green Farriseth meeting at a Bensonhurst storefront. He served as acting boss from early 2010 until 2012, when he was imprisoned. Anthony Little Anthony Pipitone, captain operating in Queens, Brooklyn, and Long Island. On October 7, 2009, Pipitone was indicted along with Capo Joseph Sammartino, Capo Anthony Sclafani, acting captain Joseph Loiacono, soldiers Frank Pastore and Paul Spina, among other members on racketeering charges. In June 2016, Pipitone was sentenced to 2 years in prison for violating his parole when he attended a Bonanno family Christmas party on Staten Island. Pipitone had served time in prison for stabbing 2 men after they had broken windows of a mob-connected restaurant in Whitestone, Queens. On August 16, 2022, Pipitone was among 9 men arrested, including his younger brother Vito, and charged with racketeering, money laundering, illegal gambling, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and other charges. Members from the Bonanno, as well as the Genovese families, were arrested. The group used front businesses in Queens and Long Island to launder illegal profit. Pipitone was released on $2 million bond. Ernest Ernie Aiello, captain operating in the Bronx. He used to be an acting captain for Nicky Mouth Santora, along with Vito Badamo. In 2012, he and acting captain John Spirito Jr., as well as 20 to 25 Bonanno mobsters, stormed the Lucchese family-managed Coddington Club in the Bronx as a show of force. The incident emerged after Lucchese family acting boss Matthew Madonna stated he did not recognize Michael Mancuso as the Bonanno family boss. On July 9, 2013, Aiello and 8 other Bonanno family mobsters, including Santora and Badamo, were indicted on enterprise corruption, gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and drug trafficking charges. The case ended in a mistrial on May 10, 2016, along with Capo John Ciromano and soldier John Spirito Jr. Aiello stormed the Glen Cove funeral home, where a service was held honoring former captain Vito Grimaldi. The trio assaulted former acting boss Joseph Camarano Jr. and his brother Dino, allegedly on the orders of Michael Mancuso. Louis Attanasio, a former captain in the Bronx. Attanasio, along with his brother Robert and Peter Calabrese, murdered Bonanno family Sicilian faction member Cesare Bonv in 1984. On September 20, 2006, Attanasio and Peter Calabrese were sentenced to 15 years in prison for the 1984 Bonventure murder. Attanasio's projected release date is January 23, 2018. His brother, only an associate of the Bonanno family, was sentenced to 2 years of supervised release and ordered to home confinement with GPS monitoring for the first 6 months by senior United States District Judge Nicholas Garofis. He was accused of affiliating with members of the Bonanno and Gambino crime families, including playing bocce with Louis Valario, a captain of the Gambino crime family, which Attanasio pled guilty to. It was also revealed that Robert Attanasio was suffering from prostate cancer in 2017. He was released from prison on January 23, 2018. Thomas Tommy D. DiFiore, a former acting boss and former capo. In 1979, DiFiore was thrown out of the Giaccone crew for getting into an argument with capo Philip Giaccone. By 1990, DiFiore had become a captain in the family and handled most of the actives on Long Island. In May 2000, DiFiore and 2 members of the Gambino crime family, Capo Salvatore Scala and soldier Charles Carneglia, were arrested and charged with extortion. The FBI had recorded a mob sit-down on May 3, 2000, between DiFiore, Scala, and Carneglia over who had the right to extort Cherry Video, a sex shop on Long Island. On November 2, 2001, all 3 were sentenced to 63 months for extortion. DiFiore was released from prison on March 19, 2004. In 2013, he became the family underboss and acting boss for imprisoned boss Michael Mancuso. In January 2014, he was arrested on extortion charges along with Vincent Asaro. He was released from prison on August 4, 2015. You're watching the Everything Network.
Thomas Pitera grew up in the Gravesend neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York City, the son of Joseph Joe Pitera, an Italian-American from Campania in province of Salerno, and Catherine Bogowski of German and Polish descent from Rhineland-Palatinate. His father was an independent concession stand wholesale candy salesman who sold Mary Jane, Pixie Sticks, Ferrara Candy Company's Red Hots, Lemon Drops, and Bazooka Chewing Gum. Pitera attended the David A. Booty Junior High School at 228 Avenue S in Gravesend, where he left little impression with his teachers, daydreamed a lot, and was bullied by his peers because of his high-pitched voice. Before he became interested in martial arts, he wanted to become involved in professional baseball, but was too ostracized by fellow students to join the varsity baseball team. He later broke into Booty and stole the school baseball team's equipment as an act of revenge and sold it to fences in the neighborhood. He was later arrested and charged for the burglary, but was convicted as a juvenile and his record was sealed. He attended a dojo in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, and quickly rose to the top of his class. He had a daily regimen of working out, lifting weights, reading about Kyokushin fighting strategies and tactics, and watching violent films, mostly kung fu films. At the age of 12, Pitera had been a huge fan of the 1966 The Green Hornet television show, and actor Bruce Lee starring alongside Van Williams, triggering his lifelong interest in martial arts. It was later solidified in 1969 with the release of the film Marlowe starring James Garner and Lee as Lee Wong. He let his thick, straight, black hair grow down past his ears despite disapproval by his parents for not wanting him to look like a hippie, started eating sushi as a regular part of his diet, and immersed himself in Eastern philosophy. After winning an arduous kumite competition in Sheepshead Bay, Pitera spent 27 months in Tokyo, Japan, training assiduously under the revered Japanese martial arts Shihan Hiroshi Masumi in the ways of the Koryu ninjutsu. While there, he ate mostly fish, rice, and edible seaweed, and read books about war and fighting, becoming a martial artist and academic on the subject. He began to think of himself as invincible. His mother and aunt Angelina Bugowski went to visit him and were impressed with the change to his physical appearance, maturity, sensibility, and understanding of the Japanese culture and people. He was trained to use the tonfa, nunchucks, and katanas. While in Japan, he grew his hair down to his shoulders to adopt the Bruce Lee image. After his scholarship ended, he sought work in a chopsticks factory to underwrite his stay and earn more money. This led him to acquire the nickname Tommy Karate by friends and fellow mobsters, despite that he specialized in togakureryu and not karate. Upon returning to Brooklyn, Tommy joined the Bonanno crime family and quickly became one of their most feared hitmen. He belonged to a Bonanno faction headed by Cap regimes Alphonse, Sonny Red Indelicato, Frank Lino, Dominic Trinchera, and Philip Giacone. This group opposed the current leadership under boss Philip Rastelli and his leading capos Joseph Massino and Dominic Napolitano. In 1981, Massino and Napolitano set up the murders of the three rival captains in a Gravesend club co-owned by Sammy Gravano. After their deaths, Massino made peace with the rest of the leaderless faction, including Pitera. During the 1980s, he became a made man of the Bonanno family and was assigned to Lino's crew by Bonanno Consigliere Anthony Sparrow. Pitera was close to Sparrow, whose Bath Beach crew were involved in extortion, loan sharking, drug dealing, and murder, as well as robbing drug dealers and then reselling their product. Tommy's associates, Lloyd Model and Frank Martini, murdered 2 Colombian dealers and stole 16 kilograms of cocaine. The killers intended to drive their car to Staten Island to bury the bodies, but as they could not drive a stick shift, they left the car, with the bodies inside the trunk, in a Brooklyn parking garage. Martini moved back to Sicily and continued his relationship with the Bonanno crime family, while Pitera killed Tala Siksik, a Middle Eastern drug supplier, in his Brooklyn apartment. Pitera shot Siksik 4 times in the back, chopped the body up into 6 pieces, and then buried it at a secret dumping ground. Investigators eventually found 6 of Pitera's victims in a mob graveyard in Staten Island, near the William T. Davis Wildlife Refuge. Pitera had decapitated the bodies and buried the heads separately to impede their identification using dental records. Pitera's approach to murder and body disposal was cold-hearted and clinical. He used the Staten Island graveyard because he believed that the damp soil would accelerate decomposition and the wildlife refuge would ensure the bodies were not discovered during construction projects. Pitera studied books on dissection and carried a special toolkit for cutting up bodies. He always insisted on burying corpses deep enough so that police dogs could not locate their scents. Before burying body parts, he either wrapped them in plastic or placed them in suitcases. His weakness was that he enjoyed keeping jewelry and other souvenirs of his work. He was indicted for heading a drug-dealing crew and for his involvement in 7 murders, including the 1988 Johnson murder. Investigators alleged that Pitera had been involved in as many as 60 murders. Pitera's crew sold about 220 pounds of cocaine per year, multiple kilos of heroin, and hundreds of pounds of marijuana. FBI agents discovered more than 60 automatic weapons, knives, swords, and literature, such as the Hitman's Handbook and Kill or Be Killed, which dealt primarily with assassination techniques as well as torture and the dismemberment of cadavers in Pitera's apartment in Gravesend. One of Pitera's crew members, Frank Gangi, the nephew of Genovese family capo Rosario Gangi, decided to testify against him. Frank had been arrested for driving under the influence and allegedly started reliving Pitera's worst atrocities in his mind while sitting in the holding cell. Frank confessed to all the murders he was involved in with Tommy and provided information on other Pitera murders. He described how Pitera matter-of-factly murdered Gangi's girlfriend, Phyllis Birdie, while she was passed out in bed after sharing cocaine and sex with Gangi. Pitera then cut Birdie's corpse into 6 pieces in the bathroom. Gangi also testified that during a fight with a drug dealer named Marek Kucharski, Pitera pulled a knife and repeatedly stabbed Kucharski and finally cut his throat. In Pitera's trial, the chief prosecutor, David W. Shapiro, demanded the death sentence for the heinous, cruel, and depraved murders committed by Tommy Pitera. He called Pitera a heartless and ruthless killer, explaining in detail how Pitera tortured one victim by slowly, deliberately shooting him 7 times in various parts of the body, in one of a series of murders carried out in a deliberately barbaric manner. The prosecution also produced a Drug Enforcement Administration agent who testified to digging up graves containing the dismembered bodies of some of Pitera's victims. His defense lawyer, David A. Runke, urged the jury to reject the death penalty on the grounds that he had no prior criminal record and that other participants in the murders were allowed to plead guilty to lesser charges. Moreover, only 2 of the murder victims, Richard Leone and Solomon Stern, were killed on March 15, 1989, after the federal death penalty law went into effect. The 4 other murders took place earlier, so those counts carried maximum sentences of life in prison. Tommy's aunt, sister-in-law, and 2 cousins testified on his defense that he was a loving and caring family member. On June 25, 1992, Pitera was convicted of murdering 6 people and supervising a massive drug-dealing operation in Brooklyn. However, he was acquitted in the 1988 Johnson murder. During the deliberation on sentencing, the jury also rejected the death penalty for him. In October 1992, alluding to evidence that Tommy brutally killed his victims and dismembered their bodies, Judge Rena Raggi sentenced him to life in prison, saying, "Mr. Pitera, nobody deserves to die as these people died." After the verdict was read, Pitera smiled and gave a thumbs up to reporters sitting in the Brooklyn courtroom. He had avoided the death penalty. However, Pitera was irritated that Gangi was petitioning Judge Raggi for a reduction of his 10-year prison sentence. As Pitera later remarked, Gangi said he was sorry about killing 5 people and that he became an informer because he wanted to start a new life. He gets 10 years, a good deal, and he goes whimpering and weeping to the judge looking for a break. If you're really sorry for killing 5 people, you take your punishment like a man. Later in 1992, the judge again refused a motion to reduce Gangi's sentence. And on April 3, 2012, the United States Second Circuit Court of Appeals denied Tommy Pitera's motion for DNA testing of the guns and other evidence in 3 of Pitera's murders. As of April 2022, Pitera is serving a life sentence at the United States Penitentiary, McCreary near Pine Knot, Kentucky.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Calandra grew up in the Bensonhurst neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. During his childhood, he grew up seeing wise guys on the street, pulling up to the curbs in their big, shiny Cadillacs, loafing around social clubs wearing pricey suits and sporting $100 haircuts and manicured fingernails. Mafia members interacted with Calandra and the other kids in the neighborhood. They joked around with them and showed them there were other ways to make it through life. The wise guys also paid Calandra and other kids to do work for them, such as washing their cars, watching out for police, or running numbers. Calandra and his friends decided to form their own crew and became known as the Bath Avenue Crew. The original founding members included Jimmy Calandra himself, Tommy Reynolds, and Chris Paciello, who was also involved in robbing the Staten Island Mall's Chase Bank in the winter of 1992, right before Christmas. Chris Paciello sat in the car with a scanner and walkie-talkie. Calandra and Reynolds walked up to the Chase Bank window with ski masks and axe handles as the manger was loading the weekend money from all the mall's stores, deposits. Calandra smashed the window with an axe handle and jumped through the window and over the reel and grabbed the shopping cart full of canvas bags containing over $400,000 in cash, which was handed to Reynolds and wheeled it to a waiting stolen vehicle and transported. That score was never solved until after the statute of limitations was done. Calandra also had over $100,000 of loan shark money on the street, which he was collecting Vig Juice money once a week on. Calandra robbed over a dozen banks in the New York City 5 boroughs. Calandra and Joseph Calco shot an associate nicknamed Mikey Hamster, who had killed a member of their crew and was bragging about killing him. They shot him numerous times as his car stopped at a stoplight on 17th Avenue in Benson. Both Calandra and Calco were not arrested for the 3 attempted murders on Hamster's life. Hamster is now sitting in a wheelchair for life. In February 1993, Calandra, Tommy Reynolds, and Bonanno associate Chris Paciello were involved in the murder of a woman during a failed robbery attempt of her Staten Island home. They originally planned to rob her husband, Sami Shemtov, who owned several adult entertainment stores and kept large amounts of cash in his house. On May 10th of 1993, Calandra was arrested for a bank robbery and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He also has an assault charge run concurrently 4 to 8 for beating up a guy with an axe handle. Calandra was sentenced to Lewisburg Penitentiary in Pay. Once he was there, he became good friends with a guy named Matty Madonna. Matty Madonna was a real-deal gangster. As Jimmy was doing time, his own friends killed his best friend, Paulie Gulino. At that time, he knew it was time to get away from his old crew, so he asked Matty Madonna for help. He explained to Matty that when he gets home, He was going to kill some of his old buddies for revenge for Paulie Gulino. Matty stopped him and told him, "No, when I get home in a couple months, I'm going to go talk to Sparrow and tell him I want you in my crew." Matty Madonna was a Lucchese mobster. He was on the panel, and he was going to get Jimmy Calandra straightened out and become a member of the Lucchese crime family. Matty went to go talk to Sparrow, and Sparrow released Jimmy and told Matty, "You can have him." Jimmy was on his way to becoming a star in the family until his past came back to haunt him, and his old buddies started rolling on him.